Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirikoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about my top 6 quarterback rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, I'm going to be giving you guys my perspective and opinions in regards to how I think the top end of the quarterback position currently stacks up. You know, going into our 2021 fantasy football drafts, I always hear the question of, Andrew, when should I be selecting my very first quarterback? And of course, what statistics kind of give us insight as to who has the highest ceiling of potential this upcoming season? And honestly, those questions are extremely valid because in just the last 3 seasons alone, we've seen 3 of the top 6 all-time fantasy quarterback performances with Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen all surpassing 400 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. Again, the only 3 other quarterbacks that had done that, Peyton Manning, Aaron Rodgers, and Drew Brees early in the 2010s. Outside of that, those are the best fantasy quarterback performances we've ever seen. So why not another quarterback this upcoming season? The league continues to grow. I mean, last season alone, we saw the most NFL points scored in the history of the league. The game is continuing to evolve, and we've seen a lot of influences from the college football game. A lot of coordinators coming in and influencing the game to potentially be a mobile quarterback's paradise. Again, in the last couple seasons, the fantasy quarterbacks have been guys that have been able to dominate on the ground and get themselves, of course, like Lamar Jackson, back-to-back seasons of 1,000 rushing yards. Guys like Josh Allen scoring 8+ touchdowns every single season of their careers. These are statistics that are absolutely vital to the growth of the quarterback position, but the viability at said position. Now, of course, we'll cover all of that and my top 16 rankings on today's episode. But before we begin, I want to take the opportunity to thank you guys for the incredible support. For those of you who come out every single day, smash that like button and comment down below. I cannot thank you guys enough. You guys have been the backbone of this channel and will continue to help it grow. For those of you guys who have recently subscribed and help us get to that 36,000 subscriber mark, I cannot thank you enough as well. We're, of course, extremely excited about hitting 36, but we're on our way to 37 because it's just around the corner. So make sure, if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button. We're making content every single day for the entirety of the 2021 season. This offseason, we, of course, have a lot of things coming down the pike. The tier list, the strength of schedule, mock drafts, must drafts, all of that will be coming down the line, of course, until the regular season, where we'll have waiver wires, rankings for every single position, Sunday morning live streams, and of course, the fan favorite, hidden gems. We'll have all of that included this upcoming season, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Again, from the bottom of my heart, I can't thank you guys enough. You guys have been incredible. Helped me get to what I'm doing today, putting all my effort towards this channel, so thank you once again. All right, let's get into the quarterback position, beginning with a couple statistics that I wanted to focus on before I talk about my number 6 at the position. So like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the value of rushing statistics at the quarterback position, yes, it's been a little bit of a newer concept, but we've seen rushing quarterbacks dominate year over year for the past decade. I mean, Cam Newton, of course, has been the staple of that position. We saw a little bit of Robert Griffin III, but of course, Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott as the lead. But this new wave of quarterback, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, have begun to really kind of lean into the direction of rushing statistics dictating overall fantasy standings, and that has just been a fact. In a 4-point per passing touchdown format, rushing statistics have been king. And in just the past 2 seasons alone, 2019 and 2020, we've seen 6 of the top 7 overall ranked quarterbacks surpass 250 rushing yards. Now, you may be wondering why I mentioned 250 rushing yards in specific, but in my opinion, I designate a quarterback to be a mobile quarterback if they are able to surpass that many yards within a season. If a quarterback can at least, in a 16-game season, average 15.625 rushing yards per game, they'll of course eclipse that number. But if in fact they deal with an injury or miss time, they're not going to be able to. But that, in my opinion, is what defines a mobile quarterback. And we've seen 6 of the top 7 in back-to-back seasons accomplish that. Though some may believe it, it hasn't gotten to the point where, in my opinion, the rushing statistics that quarterbacks have been able to garner are completely eliminating the value of passing statistics. I don't think that may be the case. I just honestly believe that the quarterbacks that have begun to take over the National Football League and are the new wave of quarterbacks, as of course the Phillip Rivers and the Drew Breeses begin to retire, I think this new wave of the quarterback has really elevated not only their pocket presence, but their ability to at least be more dynamic. They're just as talented with their arms. I mean, just looking at this past couple seasons, when we compare Josh Allen to Tom Brady in passing statistics alone last season, Josh Allen put up 319.76 fantasy points just with his arm. Tom Brady, 333.32. The fantasy point difference overall goes in the direction, yes, of Tom Brady last season with 13.56. But to be honest, We're forgetting the fact that Josh Allen scored 90.1 fantasy points with his legs. That is the biggest difference maker. They're just as valuable with their arms, but when you add that rushing mobility and the upside, the ceiling that they present, what more could we ask for? To expand that conversation, of course, I wanted to kind of give an equivalency to what 250 rushing yards equals. We all know in a standard league, 250 rushing yards is 25 fantasy points. Or you can compare it to an extra 625 passing yards or an extra 6.25 passing touchdowns in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. So sure, 25 points may not seem like a lot, but I went and did my homework. In the past decade, there have been 92 quarterback performances that have surpassed 250 rushing yards. In those seasons where those quarterbacks, of course, surpassed 250 rushing yards, they averaged 4.02 rushing touchdowns in said seasons. Okay, great. So not only are we getting a little bit of that 250 rushing yard boost, which is 25 points, we're getting an extra 4.02 rushing touchdowns, which of course we know rushing touchdowns have a little bit of an edge over passing touchdowns, which kind of elevates that lead from 25 points to 49 points. Now, if you're looking to expand those statistics and talk about the new wave of rushing quarterbacks, guys that can surpass 400 rushing yards like Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen have consistently done in their careers, we went ahead and saw that there were 42 quarterback performances in the past decade that surpassed 400 rushing yards in a season. Those quarterbacks averaged 5.22 rushing touchdowns a season, which again, if you just kind of round it down to 5 extra touchdowns, you get yourself a 65 fantasy point difference between a quarterback that is a pocket passer like Kirk Cousins or Tom Brady in comparison to a mobile quarterback. And though those statistics at times may only just even the playing field between the two quarterbacks, it at least gives more and more upside for those quarterbacks that are just as equivalent in the passing game like a Josh Allen and or a Patrick Mahomes, or guys that are absolutely just torching through the air and able to gather those yardage on the ground, and of course the touchdowns following with that. With all of that said, we can go ahead and move on to our top 6 quarterback rankings for the 2021 season, beginning with our number 6, Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, when I think of Dak Prescott, I think of consistency first and foremost. A lot of people, of course, correlate Dak Prescott with unfortunately having a season-ending injury last season, but from 2016 to 2019, he was an incredible quarterback, scoring 28 plus touchdowns every single season and finishing as a top 12 quarterback in 4 consecutive seasons, finishing as the number 2, 12, 10, and 6 overall guy. That in itself is fantastic. We love to see a consistent quarterback year over year find that productivity, and mainly because, of course, the rushing ability. Every single season of his career that he's been healthy, of course, he has been within that mobile designation, has surpassed 250 rushing yards. In 3 of his 5 seasons that he's played in the National Football League, he has surpassed 6 touchdowns in a year. He's getting himself goal line opportunity. He's getting himself extended plays with his legs. But just recently in 2019, he was getting it done through the air. 4,900 passing yards, 30 passing touchdowns in his career. When we include, of course, 2016 through 2019 and the first 4 games of the 2020 season, he's averaged 21.33 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. Dak Prescott certainly has a high ceiling going into the 2021 season, especially building off of what he was able to do last year. I mean, from the first 4 weeks of the season in 2020, he was averaging 31.3 fantasy points per game. Now, certainly the argument can be made that if in fact Dak Prescott had a healthy offensive line last season, his production could have been even better. But going into 2021, he'll have that. Lyle Collins did not play an entire game last season. He's the starting right tackle. Zach Martin, the best guard in the National Football League, only played 8 games last season, and Tyron Smith only played 2. So once you get a fully healthy Dallas Cowboys offensive line together, and you're going into your second year with a Mike McCarthy offense, I think Dak Prescott has a very high potential going into 2021. On top of the fact that, sure, a lot of his production was because of the fact that the Dallas Cowboys defense wasn't able to stop anyone. I know they changed their defensive coordinator. They brought in a lot of talent. They drafted defensively this offseason. If in fact that defense is just as bad as they've always been, it's only going to help Dak, as he's going to come out every single time and try to put points up on the board. And with how talented that wide receiver core is, that tight end room, that running back position, even the second running back on their team, Tony Pollard, they have so much talent on this offense that Dak Prescott is just surrounded with, some would believe, the best offense in the National Football League. You can put any quarterback in this conversation. Imagine putting Aaron Rodgers on that offense. You're going to have yourself a lot of productivity there. Either way, when we move on to his rushing statistics, again, throughout his entire career, He's averaged 19.37 rushing yards per game and 0.358 rushing touchdowns per game. That definitely makes a huge difference. Throughout a 16-game season, the guy's averaging about 270 to 300 rushing yards and getting himself at least 4 rushing touchdowns, which is the average amongst the 92 quarterbacks that I mentioned earlier of the past decade. So he continues to stand in line there. I, of course, want to continue on the topic of Dak Prescott's consistency because I think that's a huge part of the argument as to why I want to continue to invest in him, despite a lot of people thinking he may not be worth the potential draft stock that you'd be paying for him going into this upcoming season. In terms of consistency, Dak Prescott, in the 36 games that he's played since 2018, 52.78% of them have been 20-plus fantasy points, and only 25% of them have been less than 15 points. Again, there's a little bit of volatility there, but 75% of his performances are on par and ready to go, giving you guys fantasy point performances that are above and beyond more than 52%, a little bit more than 52% of the time. And on top of that, 14 of his 36 games, which is pretty much 39% of them, have been 3-plus touchdowns. 64% of his games have been 2-plus touchdowns, and a slight 14% 4-plus touchdowns. He has upside. He has the ability, and with the consistency at his core, I think he's got a lot of potential going into 2021, and that's why we have him as our number 6 quarterback. Another quarterback that I always talk about with consistency, and perhaps even more consistent than Dak Prescott, is Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson has never missed a game in his entire NFL career. That's 9 years. He has not missed a single game, and throughout that time, he has been unstoppable. Not only has he completed the mobile designation, surpassing 250 rushing yards every season of his career, he's been able to also score on the ground a lot. He's averaged 31.28 rushing yards per game and 0.146 touchdowns per game. All in all, when we go back to 2017 and kind of compound all the statistics, Russell Wilson has led all quarterbacks in total touchdowns with 148. In that time span, of course, he's averaged 21.42 fantasy points per game, and in 5 out of the last 6 seasons, he's scored 34-plus touchdowns. The consistency has unbelievably been there, and this offense continues to build. Of course, you have DK Metcalf taking another step forward in 2020. You're going to go ahead and see him expand his role in 2021. Tyler Lockett has consistently been there year in and year out as a huge part of this offense in the slot position. You bring in Gerald Everett to kind of solidify that tight end position that, of course, they thought Greg Olsen could do last season, but Greg Olsen, of course, getting up there in age, retired, didn't really have that great of a season based on injuries. Of course, this offensive line has been the most shaky, part of the entire team. But in my opinion, when you bring in Shane Waldron, the former passing coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams, and you go ahead and kind of change the entire scheme and approach for Russell Wilson in 2021, I think we're going to see a lot more of Russell Wilson of what we did in the first 9 games of last season in comparison to what we saw in the second half. A lot of people are afraid of Russell Wilson based on his productivity in the second half of the season, but that entire offense has consistently come out and said publicly that they weren't really adjusting to what defenses were throwing at them. They were running the same offense, and teams were able to watch film and consistently stop them week in and week out. And we obviously saw that based on the fantasy point, productivity drop that Russell Wilson saw in comparison from the first half to the second half of the season. I expect Russell Wilson to be consistent as ever. Again, he has always finished as a QB1 throughout his entire career, besides never missing a game. The guy in the last, 5 seasons has finished as the number 9, 1, 9, 4, and 6 overall quarterback in fantasy football. I think he's got a great amount of potential, of course, with his productivity on the ground and his potential to score a bunch of touchdowns through the air, 34 plus in 5 out of the last 6 seasons. I think the sky's the limit for Russell Wilson. This offense continues to build. If they can let Russ cook this upcoming season, similar to how he was the first half of last season, I think he can certainly enter the top 5 conversation at the quarterback position and maintain a standing there. All right, we move on to our next quarterback for the 2021 season, which is Lamar Jackson, the new wave of quarterback, a quarterback that since taking the starting job for the Baltimore Ravens in week 11 of the 2018 season has scored more points than any other fantasy football quarterback. That's 896.62 fantasy points. Nobody has scored more points than Lamar Jackson since then. And of course, like we all know, besides being the second quarterback in NFL history to surpass 1,000 rushing yards, he went ahead in 2020 and broke another record, becoming the first quarterback ever to surpass 1,000 rushing yards in 2 seasons, much less back-to-back seasons. Lamar Jackson is a freak of nature. He is one of one, and no one is going to be able to fill his spot in the future. And hopefully, perhaps his influence on the league will expand the role of the quarterback position. We'll see more mobility there. But in terms of what he has supplied to the fantasy football community, in terms of consistency and always being able to score high volume of points based on, of course, the rushing ceiling, it's just been more than we could potentially ask for. Lamar Jackson has averaged 24.23 fantasy points per game in the 37 games that he's played as the starting quarterback of the Baltimore Ravens. Since taking over, of course, the starting quarterback role, the Baltimore Ravens have led the National Football League in total rushing attempts, being number 1 in 2018, 19, and 20, and I don't think they're stopping anytime soon. This entire offense is surrounding Lamar Jackson and making sure that not only is he comfortable in the pocket, but being able to run in lanes in which, of course, with that read option gives so much more potential when you're the most athletic guy on the field. Again, besides being able to surpass 250 rushing yards a season, he's been able to do that in tenfold. Of course, his rookie season had 556 rushing yards, 1,206 the following season in 2019, and finished last year with 1,005. Of course, every season he's been able to score on the ground. This past 2 seasons, he scored 7+ rushing touchdowns, and he's gotten himself a lot of work in the red zone. In fact, he's had 90 red zone rushing attempts in his career that have led to 13 rushing touchdowns. So a lot of his production getting down into the red zone when teams are thinking they're going to hand the ball to Mark Ingram, Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, or potentially a play action is going to set up Mark Andrews. Lamar Jackson has been able to take advantage of defenses and score with his legs, averaging 74.78 rushing yards per game and 0.486 rushing touchdowns per game. So to put that in perspective, that's 7.5 fantasy points. Okay, that's almost the equivalent of 2 passing touchdowns for a normal quarterback in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. On top of the fact that he's averaging a touchdown every other game, my goodness, Lamar Jackson just won't stop there. In terms of his consistency and his productivity, of course, like I mentioned, 24.23 fantasy points per game. A lot of that has been built off the back of scoring a lot of touchdowns. I mean, we'll remember going into 2019, a lot of us expected him to have great rushing totals, but we didn't expect him to throw 30+ touchdowns, which he did, and he dominated. When we look at the 37 games that he's played in his career as the starting quarterback of the Baltimore Ravens, in 15 of those games, which is 40%, he scored 3+ touchdowns. In 25 of those games, he has scored 2+ touchdowns, which is 67%. He's always producing an incredible amount of fantasy points, and he's got himself a good division to play in. I mean, he has found success against the Cincinnati Bengals, Pittsburgh Steelers, and Cleveland Browns in his career. He's averaged 24.74 fantasy points per game against them. The fact that he plays them 6 times a year only continues to build his potential productivity, on top of the fact that this offense is continuing to build pieces around him. Of course, Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown are established commodities in this offense, but when you bring in a wide receiver like Rashad Bateman, who this offseason already, we've seen a lot of film from him from training camp, being able to torch Marlon Humphreys, one of the best secondary corners in the National Football League, on top of the fact that you bring in a veteran like Sammy Watkins, who's played in an offense that has been to the Super Bowl in back-to-back seasons. That veteranship should help grow these young wide receivers and even potentially help Lamar Jackson grow as a quarterback. I think everything's just continuing to build in his direction. Again, one of the most consistent and the highest scoring quarterbacks since taking over the league. I think Lamar Jackson can easily be in the top 5. The number 4 spot is just a humble spot for him, assuming he doesn't completely go off and get back to his 2019 days, which is definitely possible. We'll just have to wait and see. We'll go ahead and move on and talk about our next quarterback, which is Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. I have Kyler Murray as my number 3 overall quarterback going into the 2021 fantasy football season because I see a lot of potential with Kyler Murray. And though there are some arguments that speak to his kind of overdependence of his rushing ability, I really do think that Kyler Murray can expand, learn to be more of a pocket passer, and continue to grow his total fantasy point contribution on a weekly basis. Now, from weeks 1 through 9 of the 2020 season, we saw the full line potential of what Kyler Murray is capable of producing. He was averaging 30.16 fantasy points per game. If he was able to sustain that over a 16-game season, he would have definitively, created the greatest fantasy point performance in a single season ever. He would have surpassed Patrick Mahomes, Peyton Manning, Lamar Jackson by tenfold. I mean, those guys in their greatest seasons of all time were averaging about 25, 26 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. Again, he was averaging 30.16. Kyler Murray was unstoppable for the first half of the 2020 season, but unfortunately had to slow down a little bit. Again, he talked about He wanted his rushing yards to be a luxury rather than something that he had to commit to every single game. And of course, being a smaller quarterback, he's going to get injured. And we've seen him miss time over the last couple of seasons late in the year because, again, the injuries begin to pile up and catch up to him. But with all of that said, I think going into another season of a Cliff Kingsbury offense, bringing in other wide receivers like A.J. Green, Rondale Moore, you bring in one of the, if not the best pass blocking centers of all time, a guy like Rodney Hudson, who, according to PFF, has been one of the best centers over the past decade. We can go ahead and potentially see an extra step from Kyler Murray in his potential growth. Now, of course, his rushing yards have been huge for him. Last season, 819 on the ground for 11 rushing touchdowns. That is an unbelievable statistic. In his career thus far, has averaged 43.97 rushing yards per game and 0.484 rushing touchdowns. That's a touchdown every other game. And that's 4 fantasy points, or at least 4.4 fantasy points per game, which is an extra touchdown. Again, he is unbelievable on the ground, and it certainly is kind of making up for some of his lack of productivity through the air. One of the biggest arguments against Kyler Murray is the fact that through the air, he's not one of the best quarterbacks. I mean, when we compare him to the rest of the quarterbacks in the National Football League last season in passing statistics alone, Kyler Murray would have been the number 15 overall quarterback if we isolated just his passing statistics. Phillip Rivers would have scored more than him in just passing statistics alone, but Kyler Murray scored 147.9 points on the ground. That is a lot of productivity. And if in fact we end up seeing Kyler Murray consistently producing these kind of numbers on the ground, then of course he's going to potentially be able to be one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy football history. But if he continues to shy away from that rushing potential, we're going to need to see some big gains in terms of what he's potentially able to do in the passing game. And I think bringing in more wide receiver help, building this offensive line, that is the next step in doing so. Like I did with the 3 prior players, I always like to mention fantasy consistency at the quarterback position because we don't want volatility there. We want a guy that can score 20 plus points every single week. And that's what Kyler Murray's been able to do. 54.84% of his performances throughout his career thus far, 17 of the 31 games, have been for 20 plus fantasy points. In fact, he's had 38.71% of his performances for 3 plus total touchdowns scored. I see consistency there, and it's continuing to grow, especially the steps that he took from year 1 to year 2, the building of this offensive line, the wide receiver position, and another year of experience. I know Kyler Murray getting injured late in the season could definitely be a little bit of a struggle, but if they continue to just build around him, allow him to find more comfort in the pocket, I think this guy has a very high potential ceiling going into our 2021 season, and that's why I have him as my number 3. As we look forward, we throw up Josh Allen on the screen, the thumbnail for today's video, our number 2 quarterback going into the 2021 season. I think Josh Allen is a very safe quarterback play in 2021, obviously based on the fact that he's the number 1 overall quarterback in 2020. But the issue that I have with Josh Allen is that there's going to be regression. Since 2013, there has not been a quarterback that has finished as the number 1 ranked overall quarterback in a 4-point per passing touchdown format that have followed their number 1 ranked season with a statistical improvement or even being statistically even. They've always regressed and regressed a fair amount of points. We saw it with Lamar Jackson. We've seen it with Patrick Mahomes. We've seen it with many MVP quarterbacks that year over year, after you rank as the number 1 fantasy quarterback, you're going to have a little bit of regression. But despite that regression that I anticipate with Josh Allen, I still think he's been absolutely incredible, averaging 23.11 fantasy points since coming back from the injury that he sustained in 2018, his rookie season. He's been an incredible fantasy asset, and that hasn't only just been through the air, it's been on the ground. He's had 605, 510, and 421 rushing yards in the first 3 years of his career, and 8 plus rushing touchdowns every single season. That averages out to 36.56 rushing yards per game and 0.595 rushing touchdowns per game. That's the highest average of touchdowns that we've seen throughout all the quarterbacks that we've mentioned thus far today. On top of the fact that he's had 67 red zone rushing attempts for 23 touchdowns since 2018. If we go back to 2020, a lot of people want to talk about Zach Moss, Devin Singletary potentially having fantasy value. Josh Allen fills that role as he's the number 1 RB on their own respective team. In 2020, he had 11 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line for 7 rushing touchdowns, when in fact defenses are filling the middle, and you can potentially use a little bit of that read option because of his mobility and send Zach Moss up in the middle and come off the edge and score a touchdown. The mobility of Josh Allen has been his greatest fantasy asset and has kind of elevated him to that next level. That's on top of the fact that the addition of Stephon Diggs really did help him overall in terms of overall accuracy. He was able to surpass 300 passing yards for the first time in his career in 2020. these continue to build. The accolades are going to continue to build, as this is still a young quarterback signing a $100 million deal just the other day. Congratulations to him. But being an extremely fantasy consistent quarterback, 2+ touchdowns in 73.81% of the time that he's played, my goodness, he's going to continue to grow. And I think bringing in an Emmanuel Sanders, another veteran wide receiver, building this offensive line up a little bit more. This is one of the highest scoring offenses in the National Football League in 2020. And I think they'll continue to expand upon that. A little bit of regression is going to sit here for Josh Allen, but I ultimately think he's still going to be a top 3 quarterback play, and specifically my number 2. We move on to our last quarterback, and it should be no surprise that Patrick Mahomes is the number 1 overall quarterback on my list. He has been the most consistent quarterback in fantasy football since he took the job in 2018. In that time, he's averaged 24.87 fantasy points per game and finished as the number 1, 8, and 4 overall quarterback in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. On top of the fact that, of course, he had that 50 passing touchdown season, he has just continued to build on his overall productivity. Besides his productivity that he's been able to find through the air, of course, being able to throw the ball to Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, that is just in itself going to always be a bonus for him. But being able to expand your role and be able to gain yards on the ground, he has at least averaged 18.09 rushing yards per game throughout his career, which of course gives him the mobile designation if he plays a full 16-game season. In 2019, was not able to do so because he missed 3 games and therefore wasn't able to, but every single season of his career has averaged around 270 to 300 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. He'll continue to stay consistent with that number, and if in fact he does, he's just continuing to build the advantage on other quarterbacks, besides the fact that he's able to throw for 4+ touchdowns 11 times in his 44-game career, which is 25% of the games. He's had more 4 touchdown plus games than he's had games in which he's only scored 0 or 1 touchdowns. That's an 11-9 ratio. I mean, these are unbelievable numbers. 81% of his games, 81.81 in specific percent of his games, 2+ touchdowns. 52.27% of his games, 3+ touchdowns. He has scored 20+ fantasy points in 72.72% of his overall games. Patrick Mahomes has been an absolute success every single week and is by far the most consistent quarterback in fantasy football. And that's why he's the first guy to come off the board. Because you want consistency, you have to invest in it. If you want a quarterback that week in and week out is going to put up 20 to 22.5 fantasy points plus, that's just the base minimum on a weekly basis, Patrick Mahomes is your guy. And I think there's an argument for him in every single statistical category up and down the quarterback position. I know he doesn't rush as much as these other quarterbacks, but he's able to make it up with his arm talent because, again, a lot of the receivers he has are just far better than what other teams have in their stead. Taking all those statistics into consideration, this team has been one of the highest scoring offenses in the National Football League since Patrick Mahomes has taken over. But the thing that they haven't been able to do consistently is protect Patrick Mahomes. This last season dealt with some injuries, but was able to at least fight through them and get them to the Super Bowl, and unfortunately weren't able to capture that. A lot of the big issues were offensive line, especially in that championship game where, of course, you had your left tackle and your right tackle out. They went ahead and addressed that. They brought in 5 new offensive linemen for the 2021 season. They traded for a left tackle. They brought in a bunch of studs up front that are hopefully going to give him not only more time, but able to establish more of a running game. Because if you can hit play action with Patrick Mahomes, especially with speedsters like McCole Hardman and Tyreek Hill on the outside, it just continues to expand this offense and its potential fantasy point productivity. I think Patrick Mahomes, bar none, is the top quarterback going into our 2021 season. It is no conversation, unless, of course, somebody's going to come out of nowhere. I think Patrick Mahomes holds the top spot throughout a full 17-game healthy season. Those are my top 6 quarterback rankings going to the 2021 fantasy football season. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comment section. Who do you think can join this group? Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Justin Herbert. There are a lot of other quarterbacks that could have been in this conversation, but again, I very much so value rushing statistics in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. In a 6-point, we of course are involving those other guys because they're throwing for a bunch of yards and touchdowns. Either way, let me know what you guys think. Make sure you smash that like button. And if you have not yet already and you like today's content, hit that subscribe button. Thank you everybody for watching. And until tomorrow, we'll be doing a full PPR live mock draft. Thank you guys, and I'll see you guys. Peace.